The boy sat in the rubble, knees pulled to his chest, a charred pencil stub gripped between blackened fingers. Around him, the city of Dresden smoldered in silence. February 1945. The air tasted of ash and ending things. He was drawing, not flowers. Not his mother's face, though he could barely remember it now. Not the sun, which he hadn't seen in weeks through the smoke that hung over the ruins like a burial shroud. He drew soldiers, row after row of them, marching across torn paper he'd pulled from beneath a collapsed wall. Their helmets were crooked, their rifles pointed at nothing. But they marched, and that was all that mattered to him, because marching soldiers meant someone was still alive, still moving forward, still believing there was somewhere to go. His name was Klaus Adler, and he was 9 years old. He only knew war. He didn't remember peace. Didn't remember when the streets were full of people instead of ghosts. Didn't remember when the sky wasn't cut with searchlights every night, or when sleep didn't mean waking to sirens that turned your blood to ice water. What he remembered was the sound boots made on cobblestones, the way his father's uniform smelled, wool and tobacco and something sharp that made his eyes water. He remembered his mother's hands shaking as she packed bread into his father's rucksack. Bread they couldn't afford to give away. Bread that meant Klaus would go to bed hungry that night and the night after. But most of all, he remembered the last thing his father said to him. "Draw me something brave. Klaus, when I come home I want to see what brave looks like." That was 3 years ago. Stalingrad had swallowed his father whole, like it swallowed 500,000 other men, and never gave any of them back. So Klaus drew soldiers. He drew them charging across fields. He drew them standing guard while imaginary families slept safely behind imaginary walls. He drew them winning battles that real soldiers kept losing, over and over, until the whole world seemed to be on fire. A shadow fell across his paper. Klaus looked up slowly. Through the haze of smoke and dust, a figure emerged. An American soldier, rifle slung over his shoulder, helmet pushed back on his head. Young, maybe 19, maybe 20. His uniform was caked in the same ash that covered everything else, making him look like a ghost that had learned to walk. The soldier's eyes found the drawings first, then Klaus. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Klaus had been taught to fear these men, had been told they were demons, destroyers, that they ate children and burned churches and laughed while doing it. But this soldier didn't look like a demon. He looked tired. He looked sad. He looked like someone who had seen too much and couldn't forget any of it. The soldier knelt down, slowly, like he was approaching a wounded animal. He pointed at the drawings. "You made these?" Klaus didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. He nodded. The soldier reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar. Real chocolate. Not the ersatz paste that tasted like wood shavings they'd been eating for months. He held it out. Klaus stared at it. At this small brown rectangle that represented a world he'd forgotten existed. A world where there was enough of something to share. Enough to give away to a boy who was nothing, nobody. Just another face in a city of ghosts. His hand trembled as he took it. The soldier smiled. A broken, exhausted thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then he did something Klaus didn't expect. He pulled out his own pencil and a piece of paper, and he started to draw. What did the soldier draw? And why did it make Klaus cry for the first time in 2 years? The soldier's name was James Morrison, though Klaus wouldn't learn that for another hour. What Klaus learned first was that James couldn't draw worth a damn. His soldiers looked like stick figures with boxes for heads. His tank was a rectangle with circles. His attempt at a tree looked like a dead spider balanced on a single line. But James drew them anyway, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. And when he was finished, he pointed at Klaus's drawing, then at his own, and shrugged with such genuine embarrassment that Klaus did something he hadn't done in so long he'd forgotten how. He laughed. It was a small sound, barely there, swallowed almost immediately by the vast silence of the destroyed city. But James heard it. His face transformed, just for a second, into something almost young again. They sat together in the ruins as the afternoon light turned everything the color of old brass. James pulled out more paper. He seemed to have an endless supply of it, stuffed into various pockets of his uniform like he'd been preparing for exactly this moment. He gave half to Klaus. They drew together without speaking. James sketched a house with a porch, with what Klaus eventually recognized as an American flag hanging from it. He drew a woman with long hair standing in a doorway. And though the proportions were all wrong and the perspective impossible, Klaus understood. This was home. This was what James was fighting to get back to. Klaus drew his own memories. The apartment in Berlin before the bombs, when his little sister Anna was still alive. when breakfast meant real eggs and real butter, when the radio played music instead of reports from the Eastern Front that made his mother cry into her apron. James pointed at the little girl Klaus had drawn. Sister? Klaus knew that word. His teacher, Frau Holtzmann, had taught them English before the school was destroyed. Ja, yes, sister, Anna. James's eyes asked the question his mouth didn't need to. Klaus looked down at his drawing and carefully, deliberately, drew an X through the little girl's figure. James closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. He reached into his uniform again and this time pulled out a photograph, bent and worn at the edges from being carried close to his heart. A little boy, maybe 3 years old, sitting on a tricycle and grinning at the camera with a gap-toothed smile. Michael, James said softly, my son. The English was beyond Klaus, but the tone wasn't. The way James touched the photograph like it was made of glass and wishes. The way he looked at it like it was the only real thing left in the entire world. Klaus understood then what he'd known all along but never had words for. Soldiers weren't brave or cruel or heroic or terrible. They were just people who missed their families, people who wanted to go home, people who drew bad pictures because pictures were all they had left. Over the next 3 days, James kept coming back to the same pile of rubble where Klaus lived now. Lived being a generous word for it. He brought food, brought blankets, brought paper and pencils, brought stories told in broken German and wild hand gestures that made Klaus laugh despite everything. James told him about Texas, about land so flat you could see tomorrow coming, about his wife, Sarah, who sang in the church choir and made pecan pie that could make grown men cry, about the ranch they were going to buy after the war, where Michael would learn to ride horses and chase jackrabbits and never, ever hear the sound of artillery fire. Klaus told him about his father, about the last real Christmas they'd had in 1941, about Anna's habit of hiding vegetables under the table and feeding them to the neighbor's dog, about his mother, who'd been killed in the February bombing, buried in the basement of their apartment building with 20 other women and children who'd believed the shelter would save them. They talked about war the way survivors do, in pieces, in fragments, in stories that started strong and ended in silence, because the real endings were too terrible to speak aloud. On the 4th day, James brought someone with him. Another soldier, bigger, older, with sergeant stripes and a face that had forgotten how to smile. We're moving out, James said, the words coming slow and heavy. Berlin, final push, Klaus nodded. He'd known this was coming. Soldiers never stayed. James knelt down and pressed something into Klaus's hands. His own pencil, a full one, not worn down to nothing. And a sketchbook, a real one, with thick pages and a leather cover. You keep drawing, James said in careful German. You draw the world you want to see, not the one they gave us. You understand? Klaus nodded, throat too tight for words. James started to stand, then stopped. He pulled out the photograph of Michael one more time and looked at it for a long moment. Then with shaking hands, he gave it to Klaus. Remember him, James whispered. If something happens to me, someone should remember him. But something did happen. Something that would haunt Klaus for the rest of his life. Berlin fell on May 2nd, 1945. And Klaus heard about it 3 days later from a British soldier who shared his rations while explaining in simple words that the war was over, that Hitler was dead, that everything had finally, mercifully ended. Klaus nodded and said thank you, and took the tin of meat and the hard biscuits, but he didn't feel anything. The war being over didn't bring back his mother or Anna or his father. It didn't rebuild Dresden or Berlin or Warsaw or London or any of the 1,000 other cities that had been ground into powder. It didn't erase the sound of bombs falling, or the smell of burning flesh, or the sight of children lying in the streets like discarded dolls. The war was over, but Klaus still only knew war. He spent the summer of 1945 in a displaced persons camp outside Hamburg. Row after row of tents filled with people who had nowhere to go, who belonged to countries that didn't exist anymore, who spoke languages nobody wanted to hear. He drew constantly, filled the sketchbook James had given him, and then filled 3 more that a Red Cross worker brought him. He drew the camp, the other children with their hollow eyes and jutting bones, the aid workers who tried so hard to pretend everything would be all right. But mostly, he drew James, drew him as he'd last seen him, kneeling in the rubble with ash in his hair and hope in his eyes. Drew him standing on that porch in Texas with his wife and son. Drew him the way Klaus imagined he'd look when he finally made it home. Smiling, really smiling, the weight of war finally lifted from his shoulders. In August, A letter came. Klaus couldn't read English well, but Frau Brenner, one of the camp administrators, translated it for him. Her voice got quieter with each sentence until it was barely a whisper. The letter was from Sarah Morrison, James's wife. James had died on April 28th, 4 days before Berlin fell. A sniper's bullet during a street-to-street clearing operation. He'd been 23 years old. He was buried in a military cemetery near Munich. One white cross among thousands, all perfectly aligned, all marking boys who'd never gotten to become men. Sarah wrote that she'd found Klaus's name in James's journal, that James had written about him almost every day for those 3 days they'd spent together, that he'd called Klaus, the kid who reminded me why we're fighting, that his last letter home, written the night before he died, had mentioned Klaus's drawings and how they'd given him hope that maybe, just maybe, something beautiful could still survive in this broken world. She wrote that she was raising Michael alone now, that she sang in the church choir but couldn't remember the last time she'd made pie, that some days she could barely breathe under the weight of everything James would never see, never do, never become. She wrote that she wanted Klaus to know James had mattered, that his life had meant something, that somewhere in Texas, a boy was growing up who would never remember his father's face, but who would be told stories about a man who gave chocolate to enemy children and believed in the power of drawings to heal the world. At the bottom of the letter was a photograph. Sarah and Michael, standing in front of a small house with a porch. Michael was older now, maybe 4, still gap-toothed, still grinning. On the back, Sarah had written, "He has his father's smile." Klaus stared at that photograph for hours, at this woman and this child who had lost the same person he had, who grieved for a man who'd spent 3 days being kind to a boy he had no reason to care about. He pulled out his sketchbook and started to draw. He drew James, but this time he drew him the way he really was, not a perfect hero, not a soldier in a propaganda poster, but a tired young man who missed his family, who drew terrible pictures, who believed that giving a starving child a chocolate bar was worth more than any battle ever won. He drew Sarah and Michael, drew the house in Texas, drew the ranch that would never be built, the horses James would never ride, the life that had been stolen by a bullet that found its mark 4 days before peace came. He drew and drew until his hand cramped and the light failed and Frau Brenner came to tell him it was time for dinner, but Klaus wasn't hungry. He'd realized something terrible and true. Everyone he'd ever loved was dead, but their stories were dying too. His mother's laughter, Anna's habit of singing off-key, his father's smell of wool and tobacco, they were fading, becoming less real with each passing day, until soon they'd be nothing but names that nobody remembered, unless someone drew them, unless someone kept them alive on paper. That night, Klaus made a decision. He didn't know if it was the right one, didn't know if a 9-year-old boy who'd only known war could ever create anything that mattered. But he knew he had to try, because the dead deserved to be remembered, and Klaus was the only one left who could. Klaus Adler came to America in 1952, sponsored by a Lutheran church in Iowa that specialized in helping war orphans start new lives. He was 16 years old, spoke broken English, and carried 2 suitcases, one with clothes, one with sketchbooks. 17 sketchbooks to be exact. 7 years of drawings, 7 years of faces and names and stories that refused to die. The church family who took him in, the Webers, were kind, patient people who asked no questions about the nightmares that made him scream in German at 2 in the morning. Harold Weber was a veterinarian, gentle-handed with animals and traumatized boys alike. His wife, Dorothy, taught Klaus to make apple pie, and never once asked why he flinched at loud noises. They enrolled him in the local high school, where he was immediately marked as different. Too quiet, too serious, too old behind the eyes. The other students talked about football games and sock hops and who was dating whom. Klaus sat in the back of every classroom and drew. He drew his classmates without them knowing, captured the way Jenny Morrison, no relation to James but the name still hurt, twirled her hair when she was nervous, the way Tommy Chen hunched his shoulders like he was trying to disappear, the way every face in that Iowa school was carrying its own invisible weight, its own quiet war. His art teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed. She was a small woman with sharp eyes who'd lost her own son at Iwo Jima and recognized grief when she saw it. "You have a gift," she told him one day after class, looking through his latest sketchbook. "Not just technique, though that's good too, but you see people, really see them. That's rare." Klaus didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought of his drawing as a gift. It was just what he did, the only thing he knew how to do. Mrs. Patterson connected him with an art school in Chicago, helped him apply for scholarships, wrote recommendation letters that made him sound like someone special instead of just another broken refugee. In 1954, Klaus moved to the city, enrolled in the Illinois Institute of Art, and began formally studying what he'd been teaching himself for years. But he didn't fit in there either. The other students painted abstracts, experimented with color and form, created art that was about feeling rather than seeing. They talked about Pollock and Rothko and pushing boundaries. Klaus drew faces, drew stories, drew a little girl named Anna who'd died in a basement, drew a soldier named James who'd given him chocolate, drew his mother's hands, his father's uniform, every person he'd ever known who'd been erased by war. His professors didn't understand. "This is illustration," they said, not quite disguising their disdain. "Not fine art. If you want to be a commercial artist, that's one thing. But if you want to be taken seriously..." Klaus didn't want to be taken seriously. He wanted to remember. He nearly quit 3 times. Would have, probably, except for a chance meeting in a coffee shop near campus. The man was older, maybe 50, with salt and pepper hair and hands stained with charcoal. He was sketching in a notebook, and something about the way he held his pencil made Klaus stop and stare. "You draw," the man said. "Not a question." Klaus nodded. "May I see?" Something made Klaus trust him. He pulled out his current sketchbook, opened it to a drawing he'd done last week. Sarah Morrison and her son, standing on that porch in Texas, waiting for a man who would never come home. The older man studied it for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "My name is Howard Brody," he said quietly. "I was a combat artist. Pacific Theater. I drew what I saw because someone had to bear witness. Someone had to make people understand what war really costs." He tapped Klaus's drawing. "You understand? You're not making art. You're making testimony." That word, testimony, changed everything. Klaus wasn't an artist. He was a witness, a keeper of stories. A boy who'd grown up in hell and survived with nothing but a pencil, and the stubborn, desperate need to make sure the dead weren't forgotten. Howard became his mentor, introduced him to other combat artists, other witnesses, showed him that what he was doing mattered, that drawing the truth was more important than drawing the beautiful. That memory was an act of resistance against the erasure that war always tried to accomplish. In 1959, Klaus held his first exhibition in a small gallery in Chicago. He called it The Only World I Knew. 27 drawings, 27 stories, his family, James Morrison, the children in the displaced persons camp, the faces of war that nobody wanted to look at but everyone needed to see. 15 people came to the opening. The gallery sold nothing, but one person came who mattered, and what she told him would finally, after 15 years, let him understand what James had meant about drawing the world you want to see. Her name was Sarah Morrison, and she was older now, gray threading through her hair, lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent smiling through pain. But Klaus recognized her immediately from the photograph he'd carried for 15 years. She stood in front of the drawing he'd made of her and James and Michael, tears streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know if you were alive, if you'd gotten my letter, if any of it mattered." Klaus couldn't speak. His throat had closed around words that were too big to fit through. "Michael's 19 now," Sarah continued, her voice steadier. "He's at college, University of Texas. He wants to be a teacher." She laughed, a broken, beautiful sound. "Isn't that something? His father never made it past 11th grade, died in a war he barely understood, and his son wants to teach history, wants to make sure no one forgets." She turned to Klaus, and her eyes held something he'd never seen directed at him before. Gratitude. "You kept him alive," she said. "Not just James, though God knows, seeing him through your eyes, seeing him the way he really was. That's a gift I can never repay, but you kept all of them alive. Every face in this room, every story. You gave them immortality." Klaus shook his head. "I just drew what I saw." "No." Sarah's voice was fierce now. "You did more than that. You bore witness. You testified. You took all that death and suffering and horror, and you transformed it into something that makes people feel. That makes them remember. That makes them understand." She pulled an envelope from her purse. "Michael wrote you a letter. He wanted to come tonight, but finals. Anyway, he wanted you to know that he's grown up hearing stories about his father, about the man who gave chocolate to enemy children, about the soldier who believed kindness was stronger than bullets." She pressed the envelope into Klaus's hands. "And he wanted you to know that he's never going to forget, that his children won't forget, that your drawings made sure of it." Klaus opened the letter later that night, alone in his small apartment, surrounded by sketchbooks that had become his entire life. Michael Morrison wrote like his father had talked. Honest, straightforward, full of warmth. He wrote about growing up without a father but never feeling fatherless, because his mother made sure James stayed alive in stories. He wrote about the ranch they'd finally bought, about the horses he'd learned to ride, about the life his father had dreamed of that they'd built in his absence, and he wrote about Klaus's drawings. You showed me who my father really was. Not a hero from a war movie, not a name on a memorial, but a real person who was scared and brave and kind and flawed and human. You gave me the gift of knowing him, even though we never met. And you gave me something else too. The understanding that war isn't about glory or victory, or any of the lies they tell us. It's about people, about what we lose when we send young men to kill each other, about the families that never recover, the futures that never happen, the dreams that die in the mud. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for drawing. Thank you for surviving. Klaus folded the letter carefully and looked around his apartment at the hundreds of faces he'd drawn over the past 15 years. Anna, his mother, his father, James, the children in the camps, the soldiers from both sides, the refugees, the survivors. For the first time since that day in Dresden when an American soldier had knelt beside him and started to draw, Klaus understood what James had meant. Draw the world you want to see, not the one they gave us. Klaus picked up his pencil and opened a new sketchbook. On the first page, he drew Michael Morrison standing in front of a schoolhouse, teaching. Drew Sarah on her porch, older but peaceful. Drew the ranch in Texas with horses running free under an endless sky. Drew a world where war was just a memory, where children grew up knowing their fathers, where kindness was more common than cruelty, where people drew pictures of beauty instead of survival. He drew the world he wanted to see, and in drawing it, he helped create it. Klaus Adler went on to become one of the most important war artists of the 20th century. His work hangs in museums around the world, testimony to the cost of conflict, witness to the resilience of the human spirit. He spent his life drawing faces that might otherwise have been forgotten, telling stories that deserve to be remembered. He never married, never had children of his own, but he had thousands of children, students he taught, young artists he mentored, people who saw his work and understood that bearing witness is an act of love. He died in 2003, at the age of 67, surrounded by sketchbooks. At his funeral, Michael Morrison spoke. He was 61 by then, a grandfather himself, still teaching history, still making sure no one forgot. Klaus once told me, Michael said, his voice carrying across the church, that he only knew war, that it was the only world he'd ever understood. But I think he was wrong. I think Klaus knew something deeper than war. He knew memory. He knew testimony. He knew that love is stronger than death, that art is more powerful than bullets, that a boy with a pencil can defeat armies by simply refusing to let people be forgotten. He knew that even in the darkest times, even when the world is burning and hope is a lie we tell ourselves to make it through the night, someone has to remember. Someone has to draw. Someone has to bear witness. Klaus was that someone, and because of him we remember. If this story touched your heart, honor the memory of those who only knew war by sharing it. Let their stories live on through your words. Remember them. Draw your own version of the world you want to see. And never forget that even in darkness, a single act of kindness, a chocolate bar, a drawing, a moment of human connection, can echo across generations. Share this story. Remember their names. Subscribe to keep these memories alive.